Everyone deserves a second chance, even when the world has written them off completely. Sometimes the person standing at your door, looking broken and forgotten, carries exactly what you need to save what matters most. David Carter walked into Meridian Industries wearing a second-hand suit and carrying a worn résumé. The security guard almost turned him away. The receptionist looked uncomfortable. But David had cleaned himself up and refused to let shame stop him from trying again. CEO Jonathan Meridian sat behind his desk, ready to dismiss this uninvited interruption. He had no patience for desperate people who couldn't follow proper channels. But when David saw the framed photograph on the desk, a little girl with tired eyes and pale skin, everything changed. David recognized something the doctors had missed. Something that could save her life. What happens when a homeless man who lost everything discovers he still has the power to give a father back his daughter? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dr. David Carter had once been the youngest chief of pediatric surgery at St. Mary's Hospital. His colleagues respected him, his patients trusted him, and his wife Sarah admired the gentle way he spoke to frightened children before their operations. That was 7 years ago, before the accident that changed everything. The case still haunted him in quiet moments. An 8-year-old boy named Tommy, who came in with what seemed like routine appendicitis. David had performed hundreds of similar surgeries, but something went wrong that night. The complications were rare, the kind that medical textbooks categorize as unpreventable. But when Tommy didn't wake up after the surgery, David's world crumbled. The guilt consumed him first. Then came the sleeping pills to quiet his mind, followed by stronger medications to numb the pain. His wife tried to help, but David pushed her away. His medical license was suspended after he showed up to work intoxicated. The divorce papers arrived the same week he lost his house. Living on the streets taught David lessons no medical school could. He learned which park benches stayed dry in the rain, which convenience store clerks would let him use the bathroom, and how quickly people looked away when they saw a man carrying everything he owned in a shopping cart. The other homeless men called him Doc because he still helped when someone got sick or injured, using skills that never quite left his hands despite the tremor from withdrawal. For 3 years, David had been invisible to the world that once celebrated him. He slept in shelters when beds were available, under bridges when they weren't. The bottle became his only reliable companion, drowning memories of small hands that went limp under surgical lights and the crushing weight of failure that followed him everywhere. 6 months ago, something changed. David met Father Miguel at St. Augustine's soup kitchen, an elderly priest who had worked with addicts for 40 years. Father Miguel didn't lecture or judge. He just listened when David finally told someone about Tommy, about the guilt that aided him every day, about the medical career that ended with one terrible night. God doesn't waste pain, Father Miguel had said quietly. Sometimes our greatest failures prepare us for our most important victories. The words stayed with David through the difficult weeks of detox at the church's recovery center. He attended meetings, worked in the kitchen, and slowly began to remember who he used to be before the accident destroyed everything. The cravings still came, especially on bad days, but David held on to the hope that maybe his story wasn't finished yet. Jonathan Meridian's story was different, but equally defined by love and fear. He had built Meridian Industries from a small consulting firm into one of the city's most successful companies. But his greatest pride was his 8-year-old daughter, Emma. She had her mother's gentle spirit and her father's determination. A bright child who collected books about animals and dreamed of becoming a veterinarian. The illness started. Gradually fatigue that Jonathan and his wife Sarah initially attributed to growth spurts and busy school days. But Emma's energy never returned. Doctor visits became routine. then frequent, then desperate, as specialists struggled to identify what was slowly draining the life from their vibrant little girl. Emma's medical file grew thick with test results, each one adding more questions than answers. The pediatric team at Children's Hospital was thorough and caring, but after 6 months of consultations, they were no closer to a diagnosis. Emma's symptoms were puzzling intermittent weakness, occasional confusion, and a paleness that seemed to deepen each week despite normal blood work. Jonathan threw himself into research, reading medical journals late into the night and calling specialists across the country. His business meetings became secondary to Emma's appointments. His wife Sarah tried to maintain normalcy for their daughter, but Jonathan could see the worry lines deepening around her eyes with each inconclusive test. The photograph on Jonathan's desk showed Emma on her last good day before the symptoms worsened. The family picnic where she managed to smile despite feeling tired. Jonathan kept it there to remind himself why he worked so hard, why success mattered. Everything he built was for Emma's future, but that future seemed increasingly uncertain. The morning David walked into Meridian Industries, Jonathan was reviewing quarterly reports while fielding another call from Emma's doctor. The latest round of tests had revealed nothing new, and Jonathan felt the familiar knot of helpless frustration tightening in his chest. He prided himself on solving problems, on finding solutions where others saw obstacles. But his daughter's illness was a puzzle that defeated him completely. His assistant buzzed him about an unscheduled visitor, someone claiming to have an appointment that clearly wasn't on his calendar. Jonathan was tempted to have security remove the man immediately, but something in his assistant's voice made him curious. Perhaps it was the way she described the visitor as different, or her mention that he seemed genuinely desperate rather than dangerous. David stood in the elevator, watching the numbers climb toward the executive floor. His hands shook slightly, not from withdrawal this time, but from nervousness. The interview wasn't real. He knew that. No company would hire someone with his background, his appearance, his obvious desperation. But Father Miguel had encouraged him to try anyway, to take one step toward reclaiming his life, even if it led nowhere. The resume in David's hand was worn from folding and refolding, printed on cheap paper at the public library. It contained 7 years of emptiness where his career should have been, followed by contact information for a homeless shelter. But it also contained his medical training, his surgical experience, and the credentials that once made him one of the youngest department chiefs in the city. As the elevator doors opened onto us, polished marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows, David felt the weight of how far he had fallen. The receptionist's barely concealed disgust reminded him of how others saw him now, not as a doctor who had saved countless children's lives, but as a broken man whose best days were behind him. But David had learned something during his years on the streets. Desperation could be a teacher if you let it. It taught you to notice things others missed, to see possibilities in the most unlikely places, and to recognize that sometimes the most important conversations happened between people who seemed to have nothing in common. Jonathan's office door opened, and David stepped into a world he had once inhabited, but now felt foreign and impossibly distant. The success on display awards, photographs of groundbreaking ceremonies, handshakes with politicians all spoke of a life where problems had solutions and effort led to results. But David's eyes were drawn to something else entirely. Among the symbols of professional achievement sat a small framed photograph of a little girl whose pale complexion and tired eyes told a story that David recognized with the clarity that comes from years of medical training and the hard-won wisdom of failure. In that moment, looking at Emma's photograph, David realized why he had survived 3 years on the streets, why he had found the strength to get sober, and why Father Miguel's words about God not wasting pain suddenly made perfect sense. His greatest failure was about to become his most important opportunity to help. Jonathan Meridian barely looked up from his computer screen when David entered the office. The man across from him clearly didn't belong in the polished corporate environment. His suit was too big in some places, too tight in others, and carried the faint smell of thrift store donations. Jonathan's first instinct was to call security and end this farce before it began. "I don't recall scheduling an appointment with you, mister." Jonathan paused, waiting for a name while his fingers hovered over the phone. "Carter. David Carter." David's voice was steady despite his obvious nervousness. "I know I don't have an appointment, sir. I was hoping you might have a few minutes to speak with me about possible employment opportunities." Jonathan's expression hardened. He dealt with aggressive salespeople and desperate job seekers regularly, but most had enough sense to go through proper channels. This felt like an ambush, and Jonathan had neither time nor patience for it. "Mr. Carter, I appreciate your initiative, but we have established procedures for employment applications. You can submit your resume through our human resources department or apply online through—" "Please," David interrupted quietly, then caught himself. "I apologize. I know how this looks, sir. But if you could just give me 5 minutes, I promise I won't waste your time." Something in David's tone made Jonathan pause. It wasn't the desperate pleading he expected, but rather the careful dignity of a man who had learned to ask for help without losing his self-respect. Against his better judgment, Jonathan gestured to the chair across from his desk. 5 minutes, Jonathan said curtly. "Then you leave, and we'll pretend this didn't happen." David sat carefully, placing his worn resume on the edge of Jonathan's desk with hands that trembled slightly. "Thank you, sir. I know this is unusual. I'm not here asking for charity or special consideration. I'm here because I have skills that might be valuable to your company." Jonathan glanced at the resume, scanning quickly over David's medical training and surgical experience. The dates confused him at first. Everything stopped 7 years ago, creating a gap that no legitimate employer would overlook. "Dr. Carter?" Jonathan's tone shifted slightly. "You're a physician?" "I was," David replied simply. "I lost my license due to personal problems, but my training and experience remain valid. I understand that limits my options, but I was hoping your company might have positions that could benefit from medical knowledge consulting, research, health services administration." Jonathan studied David more carefully now, trying to reconcile the homeless man's appearance with the impressive medical credentials on paper. The contradiction was jarring, and Jonathan found himself curious despite his irritation. "What happened?" Jonathan asked bluntly. "People don't go from chief of pediatric surgery to—" He gestured vaguely at David's appearance. David had prepared for this question, but the words still came with difficulty. "I lost a patient. A child. The complications were rare, medically unavoidable, but I couldn't accept that. The guilt led to alcohol, which led to mistakes, which led to the loss of my license and everything else." The office fell silent, except for the distant hum of air conditioning and traffic far below. Jonathan found himself thinking of Emma, of the doctors who were working so hard to help her, and how devastating it must be when medicine failed despite everyone's best efforts. Jonathan began, then stopped as his eyes fell on the framed photograph of Emma on his desk. David was looking at it too, and something in his expression changed. "Your daughter?" David asked softly. "Yes." Jonathan's voice carried the protective edge that came whenever strangers noticed Emma's picture. "Her name is Emma." David leaned forward slightly, studying the photograph with an intensity that made Jonathan uncomfortable. "She's beautiful. How old is she?" Eight, Jonathan replied cautiously, unsure why he was answering personal questions from this strange visitor. "Is she sick?" David asked quietly. The question hit Jonathan like a physical blow. He looked sharply at David, wondering how a homeless man could possibly know about Emma's condition. "What makes you ask that?" David's eyes remained focused on the photograph. Years of medical training had taught him to observe details that others missed: the subtle pallor of skin, the particular tiredness around the eyes, the way illness changed a child's expression even when they tried to smile. Her coloring, David sighed carefully. The slight yellow tinge to her skin, barely visible but present. The tiredness in her eyes despite her smile. The way she's holding herself, like standing, requires more effort than it should. He looked up at Jonathan. I've seen those signs before. Jonathan felt his heart racing. No one had mentioned Emma's coloring except in passing, and most people wouldn't notice such subtle changes. You can tell all that from a photograph? 20 years of pediatric medicine teaches you to see things, David replied. Has she been experiencing fatigue, occasional confusion, episodes of weakness that come and go? Jonathan's mouth went dry. Those were exactly Emma's symptoms, the ones that had puzzled her medical team for months. How do you know that? David sat back in his chair, choosing his words carefully. Mr. Meridian, I know this is going to sound presumptuous coming from someone in my circumstances, but I think your daughter may have a condition that's often missed by conventional testing. The symptoms you describe, combined with what I can see in this photograph, suggest a rare metabolic disorder. Her doctors have run every test imaginable, Jonathan said defensively. Blood work, imaging, genetic screening, everything comes back normal or inconclusive. That's exactly why this condition is missed so often, David explained. Standard tests don't reveal it because it affects cellular metabolism in ways that require very specific diagnostic procedures. Most pediatricians never see a case, so they don't know to look for it. Jonathan stared at David, torn between hope and skepticism. The man across from him looked like he lived on the streets, smelled like he hadn't had access to regular showers, and had admitted to losing his medical career due to drinking. But he was describing Emma's symptoms with an accuracy that her own medical team hadn't achieved after months of testing. What kind of condition? Jonathan asked quietly. It's called mitochondrial cytopathy with secondary copper accumulation, David said. The mitochondria in her cells can't process certain enzymes properly, which leads to a gradual buildup of copper in her tissues. It causes the exact symptoms you describe: fatigue, confusion, weakness, and the subtle color changes I can see in her skin. If you're right, Jonathan said slowly, what happens if it goes untreated? David's expression grew somber. The copper accumulation will continue, affecting her liver, brain, and other organs. Without treatment, the condition is progressive, and eventually, he stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Fatal, Jonathan whispered. But it's completely treatable if diagnosed correctly, David said quickly. The therapy involves chelation to remove excess copper and enzyme supplements to support mitochondrial function. I've seen children make complete recoveries when the condition is caught in time. Jonathan felt dizzy. This homeless man, this failed doctor who had appeared uninvited in his office, was describing his daughter's illness with more clarity than anyone had managed in 6 months. It was impossible, ridiculous, potentially a cruel delusion from someone whose mind had been damaged by years of addiction and desperation. But the alternative that David might actually be right was too important to ignore. You said you've seen this before, Jonathan said. David nodded sadly. The patient I lost, Tommy, had the same condition. I didn't recognize it until it was too late. The guilt from that failure has haunted me every day since. But it also means I'll never miss those signs again. The office fell silent as both men contemplated the weight of what had just been shared. Jonathan studied David's face, looking for signs of delusion or manipulation, but found only the quiet confidence of medical knowledge and the deep sadness of someone who had learned from devastating failure. Why should I trust you? Jonathan asked finally. You're homeless. You've admitted to being an alcoholic. You lost your medical license. Why should I believe anything you're telling me about my daughter? David met his eyes steadily. Because I have nothing left to lose and nothing to gain by lying to you. Because I've seen what this disease does to families when it's missed, and I can't stand by and watch it happen again. And because your daughter deserves every possible chance at a full life, even if that chance comes from someone the world has written off. Jonathan looked again at Emma's photograph, then back at the broken man sitting across from his desk. Everything about the situation violated his sense of order and logic, but his daughter's life hung in the balance. If there was even a chance that David was right, what would you need to confirm your diagnosis? Jonathan asked quietly. For the first time since entering the office, David smiled. Get our doctors to run a 24-hour urine copper test and serum ceruloplasmin levels. If I'm right, the results will show elevated copper and low ceruloplasmin. From there, we can discuss treatment options. Jonathan reached for his phone, then paused. Dr. Carter, David, if you're right about this, if you can help save my daughter's life, I'll do everything in my power to help you rebuild yours. David nodded, understanding the gravity of the promise. And if I'm wrong, you'll never see me again. But as Jonathan dialed Emma's doctor to request the additional tests, both men suspected that this unlikely encounter was about to change everything. The call to Dr. Patricia Hernandez at Children's Hospital did not go as smoothly as Jonathan had hoped. When he explained that he wanted additional tests based on a suggestion from someone outside Emma's medical team, Dr. Hernandez's professional skepticism was immediate and unmistakable. Mr. Meridian, I understand your frustration with Emma's case, but we've already run extensive diagnostic tests. Adding random procedures based on outside input isn't medically sound, Dr. Hernandez said carefully. Who exactly made this recommendation? Jonathan glanced at David, who was listening intently from across the desk. How could he explain that a homeless man with no current medical license had identified symptoms that eluded an entire team of specialists? Someone with pediatric experience noticed things in Emma's presentation that might have been overlooked. I'd need to speak with this person directly before ordering any additional tests, Dr. Hernandez replied. Medical consultations require proper credentials and formal procedures. David held out his hand for the phone. Jonathan hesitated for a moment, then passed it across the desk. Dr. Hernandez, this is Dr. David Carter. I was formerly chief of pediatric surgery at St. Mary's Hospital, David said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone Jonathan had heard glimpses of earlier. I'm calling regarding Emma Meridian's case because I believe she may have mitochondrial cytopathy with secondary copper accumulation. There was a long pause before Dr. Hernandez responded. Dr. Carter, I'm not familiar with that name in our current medical community. Could you provide me with your current credentials and institutional affiliation? David's jaw tightened slightly. I'm currently between positions, but my concern is for Emma's welfare. The symptoms Mr. Meridian describes chronic fatigue, intermittent weakness. The pallor with subtle jaundice are consistent with Wilson's disease variant or mitochondrial copper transport dysfunction. That's an extremely rare diagnosis. Dr. Hernandez said, her tone shifting from dismissive to cautiously interested. What makes you suspect copper metabolism issues? The combination of neurological symptoms with the specific coloring changes, plus the fact that standard workups have been normal. Copper accumulation disorders often present exactly this way, systemic enough to cause significant symptoms, but subtle enough to evade routine testing. Jonathan watched David's transformation with fascination. The nervous, desperate man who had entered his office was gone, replaced by someone speaking with the quiet confidence of medical expertise. Even David's posture had changed straighter, more assured, as if accessing his medical knowledge had restored some part of his lost identity. I'll need to review Emma's file before considering additional testing, Dr. Hernandez said finally. Can you be available for consultation tomorrow morning? David looked questioningly at Jonathan, who nodded quickly. I'll be there, David confirmed after. Ending the call, Jonathan leaned back in his chair, studying David with new eyes. You sounded different when you were talking to her. More like a doctor, David finished quietly. It's been a long time since anyone asked for my medical opinion. I'd forgotten how that felt. What happens now? Jonathan asked. Now we wait for Dr. Hernandez to review Emma's case and decide whether to run the tests. Copper studies aren't routine, so there might be some resistance from the hospital administration due to cost and insurance considerations. Jonathan's expression hardened. Cost isn't a concern. If Emma needs these tests, she'd get them. What I'm worried about is time. How urgent is this if you're right? David was quiet for a long moment, and Jonathan could see him weighing his words carefully. Copper accumulation is progressive. Each day without treatment means more damage to her organs, particularly her liver and brain. If we're looking at an advanced case, how advanced? Based on her symptoms and their duration, I'd estimate we have weeks rather than months before permanent damage becomes a concern. The words hit Jonathan like ice water. 6 months of medical consultations had never carried this sense of urgency. Emma's doctors had been thorough, but never alarmed, treating her condition as puzzling rather than dangerous. If David was right, they had been watching their daughter deteriorate while time slipped away. I need to tell my wife, Jonathan said, reaching for his phone again. With respect, sir, you might want to wait until after we have test results, David suggested gently. If I'm wrong, you'll have put your family through unnecessary panic. If I'm right, you'll have concrete information to share rather than speculation. Jonathan paused, recognizing the wisdom in David's suggestion, but struggling with the idea of keeping this potential breakthrough from Sarah. She's been researching Emma's condition obsessively. She reads medical journals, calls specialists, joins online support groups for parents of children with undiagnosed illnesses. She'll want to know immediately. I understand, David said, but medical hope can be dangerous when it's premature. I learned that lesson the hard way with families who invested everything emotionally in treatments that didn't work. Let's get the test results first. Something in David's tone suggested painful experience with disappointed families, and Jonathan found himself wondering about the patients David had treated during his successful career, the children he had saved, the parents he had comforted, and the devastating case that had ended it all. Tell me about Tommy, Jonathan said suddenly. David's face tightened. Why? Because you mentioned him earlier, and I can see that losing him still haunts you. If you're going to help my daughter, I need to understand what happened. David was quiet for so long that Jonathan wondered if he would answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Tommy was 8 years old, just like Emma. He came in with what appeared to be acute appendicitis classic. Symptoms, textbook presentation. The surgery should have been routine. David's hands clenched unconsciously. But during recovery, he developed complications that didn't make sense. Neurological symptoms, unusual coloring, organ dysfunction. That had nothing to do with the appendectomy. The same condition you think Emma has? I know now that's what it was. But at the time, I was focused on surgical complications, infection, standard post-operative issues. I never considered metabolic disorders because his initial presentation was so clearly appendicitis. David's voice grew quieter. By the time I realized what was really wrong, the copper accumulation had caused irreversible brain damage. He died 3 weeks later. Jonathan felt his chest tighten. That's why you lost your license? Because you missed the diagnosis? I lost my license because I couldn't handle the guilt, David corrected. I started drinking to sleep, then drinking to function, then drinking to exist. I made mistakes in surgery, endangered other patients, and eventually showed up to work intoxicated. The medical board had no choice, but to suspend me. But the original case taught me that wasn't medical malpractice. It sounds like an honest mistake, a rare condition that could have fooled anyone. David shook his head. Tell that to his parents. Tell that to the boy who never got to grow up because I wasn't smart enough, observant enough, experienced enough to see what was killing him. Jonathan studied David's face, seeing the deep lines of pain and guilt that years of self-blame had carved there. Is that why you're so certain about Emma's diagnosis? Because you recognize the signs you missed before? I'll never miss those signs again, David said with quiet intensity. Tommy's death taught me to see patterns that other doctors might overlook. His tragedy gave meaning to every case I've observed since then, even from the streets. From the streets? David managed a sad smile. You'd be surprised how often I've encountered sick people who couldn't afford medical care. Drug overdoses, infections, injuries. I've provided what help I could without official sanction. The other homeless people started calling me Doc, because they knew I'd help when someone was hurt. Jonathan felt a shift in his understanding of David's character. This wasn't just a fallen doctor seeking redemption. It was someone who had never stopped being a healer, even when society had stripped away his formal role. David, Jonathan said carefully, what would it take for you to get your medical license back? Completion of rehabilitation programs, psychiatric evaluation, supervised practice hours, examination by the medical board, and demonstration of competency, David recited automatically. It's a process that typically takes 2 to 3 years and costs more money than I could earn in my current circumstances. What if money weren't an obstacle? David looked up sharply. Mr. Meridian, Jonathan, I'm not making promises I can't keep. But if you can help Emma, if you can give me back my daughter's health, then I want to explore every option for giving you back your career. For the first time since entering the office, David's composure cracked. His eyes filled. With tears he quickly tried to hide, and his voice shook slightly when he spoke. I don't deserve that kind of generosity. I made choices that destroyed my career, my marriage, my life. The consequences were earned. Maybe, Jonathan said gently, but maybe those consequences have also prepared you to save my daughter in a way that someone who hadn't experienced failure and loss couldn't. Maybe your rock bottom is actually the foundation for something better. David wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, struggling to process the possibility that his greatest failure might lead to redemption for both himself and this little girl, who shared so much with the patient he couldn't save. We should focus on Emma, David said finally. Everything else is speculation until we know whether I'm right about her diagnosis. Jonathan nodded, but made a mental note to research the medical license reinstatement process. If this homeless man could save his daughter's life, Jonathan would move heaven and earth to restore David's place in the world he had once called home. Emma Meridian was coloring at the kitchen table when her father arrived home that evening, accompanied by a stranger who looked different from the usual business associates who visited their house. She glanced up from her art supplies, a drawing of a horse running through a meadow, and offered the shy smile that had always been her father's greatest weakness. "Hi, Daddy," she said, though her voice carried the fatigue that had become so familiar over recent months. "Who's your friend?" Jonathan knelt beside Emma's chair, his heart aching as he noticed the paleness David had identified in the photograph. How had he missed something so obvious? "Emma, this is Dr. Carter. He's going to help us figure out why you've been feeling tired." David approached slowly, his manner gentle and non-threatening. Years of working with sick children had taught him that his appearance might frighten young patients, especially in his current circumstances. "Hello, Emma," he said softly, maintaining a respectful distance. "That's a beautiful horse you're drawing. What's his name?" "Thunder," Emma replied, warming slightly to David's obvious interest in her artwork. "He's very fast, but he's also very gentle. He helps people who are lost find their way home. David smiled at the unconscious wisdom in her words. That sounds like a very special horse. May I sit down? Emma nodded, and David carefully took the chair across from her. He found himself struck by how much she resembled the photograph on her father's desk, but also by subtle details that confirmed his diagnostic suspicions. The particular way she held her colored pencils, the slight tremor in her small hands, the way she seemed to need extra support from the chair back. Sarah Meridian entered the kitchen at that moment, stopping short when she saw the stranger sitting with her daughter. Her maternal instincts engaged immediately, and she looked questioningly at Jonathan. Sarah, this is David Carter, Jonathan said carefully. He's a pediatric specialist who noticed some things about Emma's condition that might be significant. Sarah's expression remained guarded as she studied David's appearance. His secondhand clothes and obvious circumstances suggested he wasn't affiliated with any medical institution she would recognize. I don't understand. Dr. Hernandez didn't mention any new consultants. Dr. Carter contacted me independently, Jonathan explained, avoiding the complete truth for now. He has some theories about Emma's diagnosis that we're going to explore. David understood the delicate position Jonathan was in. How could he explain that a homeless man had potentially identified what an entire medical team had missed? Mrs. Meridian, I know this is unusual. I'd like to spend a few minutes observing. Emma, if you're comfortable with that. Sometimes fresh eyes can notice patterns that others might miss. Sarah's protective instincts warred with the desperate hope that had driven her through 6 months of medical uncertainty. What kind of specialist are you, Dr. Carter? I'm a pediatric surgeon, David replied truthfully, though he didn't elaborate on his current status. I've worked with children who have complex, difficult-to-diagnose conditions. Emma looked up from her coloring. Are you going to make me better? The simple question hit David like a physical blow, reminding him of Tommy's similar words just before the surgery that had gone so terribly wrong. He managed to keep his voice steady as he answered. I'm going to try my best to help your doctors figure out what's making you feel sick, he said gently. Can you tell me about the tired feelings? When do they come, and when do you feel more like yourself? Emma considered the question seriously, her young face thoughtful. It's like there's a heavy blanket on me sometimes. In the mornings, I feel okay, but by afternoon, the blanket gets heavier. And sometimes my hands shake when I try to write or draw. David nodded, recognizing the classic pattern of copper accumulation symptoms, worse with fatigue, improving with rest, but progressively getting more frequent and severe. Do you ever feel confused, like your thoughts are fuzzy? He asked. Sometimes, Emma admitted quietly. Like I know what I want to say, but the words get lost between my brain and my mouth. Sarah moved closer to the table, her concern deepening. She's been having more trouble with that lately. Her teachers have noticed it too. David's diagnostic certainty strengthened with each symptom Emma described. The progressive nature, the particular combination of physical and neurological effects, the way standard medical testing had failed to identify the cause, everything pointed to the same condition that had killed Tommy. Emma, would it be okay if I listened to your heart and looked at your eyes? David asked. I promise I won't hurt you. Emma looked to her parents for permission, and Jonathan nodded encouragingly. David pulled a small penlight from his jacket pocket, one of the few remnants from his medical practice that he'd never been able to throw away. As David gently examined Emma's eyes, checking for the subtle ring of copper deposits that would confirm his diagnosis, he found himself transported back to his former life. His hands moved with the practiced confidence of thousands of pediatric examinations, and Emma responded to his gentle manner with the trust that sick children instinctively gave to healers who understood their fear. Your eyes are very pretty, David said as he completed his examination, and your heart sounds strong. You're a brave girl, Emma. Emma smiled at the compliment. but David could see the exhaustion in her expression. Even this brief interaction had tired her more than it should have in a healthy 8-year-old. Sarah watched the examination with growing confusion and hope. Despite his appearance, David moved and spoke like the pediatric specialists she had consulted over the past months, confident, gentle, obviously experienced with frightened children. "What do you think?" Sarah asked quietly. David chose his words carefully, knowing that premature hope could be as cruel as despair. "I think Emma has some symptoms that suggest specific diagnostic tests might be helpful. I've spoken with Dr. Hernandez about running some additional studies." "What kind of tests?" Sarah pressed. "Blood and urine tests that look at how Emma's body processes certain minerals," David explained. "If I'm right about what might be causing her symptoms, these tests will give us clear answers." Emma yawned, the brief examination having depleted her limited energy reserves. "Mommy, I'm tired. Can I go rest on the couch?" Sarah helped Emma settle in the living room with her favorite blanket, then returned to the kitchen where David and Jonathan were speaking in low voices. "She's gotten worse since her last appointment," Sarah said, her voice tight with worry. "The confusion episodes are happening more frequently, and she can barely stay awake through a full school day." David's expression grew more serious. "How long has she been experiencing the cognitive symptoms?" "About 2 months consistently, but there were isolated incidents before that we attributed to being overtired," Sarah replied. "Why? What does that mean?" "It suggests progression," David said carefully. "The condition, I suspect, affects the brain as well as other organs. The fact that her neurological symptoms are worsening indicates we need to move quickly with diagnosis and treatment." Jonathan felt his stomach drop. "How quickly?" David looked between Emma's parents, weighing how much truth they could handle without crushing their hope entirely. "If the tests confirm what I think is wrong, we'll want to start treatment within days, not weeks." Sarah sank into a chair, the weight of 6 months of uncertainty finally breaking through her composed facade. "I've read everything I could find about pediatric conditions. I've joined support groups, consulted specialists across the country, researched experimental treatments. How is it possible that you walked into our lives and immediately saw something that everyone else missed?" The question carried no accusation, only the exhausted bewilderment of a mother who had fought every battle and explored every option for her child. "Sometimes distance provides clarity," David said gently. "Your other doctors have been focused on the detailed progression of Emma's symptoms. I'm seeing her presentation with fresh eyes and the specific experience of having missed this diagnosis before." "You've seen this condition previously?" Sarah asked. David nodded, not trusting himself to speak about Tommy without breaking down completely. Jonathan intervened, sensing David's emotional difficulty. "Dr. Carter lost a patient with a similar condition earlier in his career," Jonathan explained. "That experience taught him to recognize signs that might be overlooked in standard diagnostic procedures." Sarah studied David's face, seeing the deep pain that mentioning his previous case had triggered. "I'm sorry for your loss. That must have been devastating." "It was," David admitted quietly. "But if that tragedy can help save Emma, then perhaps it wasn't meaningless after all." The 3 adults sat in contemplative silence for several minutes, each processing the strange circumstances that had brought them together. Sarah found herself studying this unlikely savior, a man whose appearance suggested he had lost everything, but whose gentle competence with Emma and obvious medical knowledge suggested depths that weren't immediately apparent. "Dr. Carter," Sarah said finally, "I don't understand your current circumstances, and frankly, I don't care. If you can help my daughter, then you have my complete support. What do you need from us?" David felt a warmth he hadn't experienced in years, the feeling of being trusted with something precious, of having his expertise valued despite his obvious failures. I need you to trust the diagnostic process, even if the results are scary. I need you to be prepared for treatments that might seem aggressive. And I need you to remember that this condition, if caught in time, is completely treatable. And if it's not caught in time? Jonathan asked the question Sarah couldn't voice. David met his eyes directly. Then Emma could experience permanent neurological damage or worse. But I don't believe we're there yet. Her symptoms suggest early to moderate progression, which means we have a window of opportunity. Sarah wiped away tears she hadn't realized were falling. When will we have test results? Dr. Hernandez said she'd try to get them expedited. Possibly by tomorrow afternoon. Definitely by the day after, David replied. What do we do until then? We watch Emma carefully for any changes in her condition. We prepare emotionally for whatever the results might show. And we hope that I'm right about both the diagnosis and the treatability. As if summoned by their conversation, Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, dragging her blanket behind her and looking like a little ghost in the evening light. "Daddy, will you read to me?" she asked in a small voice. "The words in my book keep moving around." David's heart clenched at the description, another neurological symptom that confirmed his worst fears about the progression of Emma's condition. But he managed to smile as Jonathan scooped his daughter into his arms. "Of course, sweetheart. Let's pick out a good story." As Jonathan carried Emma toward the stairs, Sarah turned back to David. "He loves her so much. We both do. She's everything to us." "I can see that," David replied. "That kind of love is powerful medicine all by itself." "Dr. Carter, David, I need to ask you something directly. Do you really believe Emma can be cured? Or are you just trying to give us hope to ease the disappointment?" Later, David considered the question carefully before answering. "Mrs. Meridian, I've learned that false hope is crueler than honest uncertainty. I believe Emma has a treatable condition, and I believe we caught it in time. But I also know that medicine isn't always predictable, and I can't promise outcomes that are beyond any doctor's control." Sarah nodded, appreciating his honesty. "That's all we can ask for someone who will tell us the truth and fight for our daughter." "I will fight for Emma," David promised. "Not just because she deserves every chance at a full life, but because I need to prove to myself that I can still be the doctor I once was. Her recovery might be the key to both our healing." As David prepared to leave the Meridian house that evening, he carried with him something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. Emma's case wasn't just about medical diagnosis. It was about redemption, second chances, and the possibility that his greatest failure might lead to his most important victory. Behind him, Jonathan read bedtime stories to a little girl whose life hung in the balance, while Sarah researched copper metabolism disorders late into the night, preparing herself for whatever tomorrow's tests might reveal. The next morning arrived with unseasonable warmth and the kind of bright sunshine that seemed to mock the gravity of Emma's medical situation. David had spent the night at a downtown shelter, staring at the ceiling and running through every detail of copper metabolism disorders he could remember. Sleep had been elusive, filled with dreams that shifted between Emma's trusting face and Tommy's final moments in the pediatric ICU. Jonathan arrived at the shelter at 7 a.m. Having told Sarah he needed to pick up David for the hospital consultation. The reality was more complex. He wanted time alone with David to understand the man he was entrusting with his daughter's life. "You didn't have to come personally," David said as he climbed into Jonathan's luxury sedan, acutely aware of how his appearance contrasted with the car's pristine interior. "I could have taken public transportation." "We're in this together now," Jonathan replied simply. "Besides, I wanted to talk before we meet with Dr. Hernandez." As they drove through morning traffic toward Children's Hospital, Jonathan found himself studying David's profile. Cleaned up and wearing clothes that Jonathan had quietly purchased the previous evening, David looked more like the successful physician he had once been. But the haunted expression in his eyes remained. a constant reminder of the tragedy that had derailed his career. "Tell me honestly," Jonathan said as they waited at a red light, "what are the chances you're wrong about Emma's diagnosis?" David considered the question carefully. "Based on her symptoms, the progression timeline, and the specific presentation I observed yesterday, less than 10% chance I'm wrong about the basic condition. The question isn't whether she has a copper metabolism disorder, it's which specific variant and how advanced it's become. And if it's advanced, then treatment becomes more complex and the recovery timeline extends, but it's still treatable," David replied. "The real danger is if we wait much longer. Another month of copper accumulation could push her past the point where neurological damage becomes reversible." Jonathan gripped the steering wheel tighter, imagining Emma struggling with permanent cognitive impairment because they had waited too long to find the right diagnosis. Why didn't her regular doctors catch this? Because it's rare, the symptoms are subtle initially, and standard testing doesn't reveal it, David explained. Most pediatricians see maybe one case in their entire career, if any. Dr. Hernandez isn't incompetent. She's just dealing with a condition outside her normal experience. They arrived at Children's Hospital 20 minutes early, giving David time to mentally prepare for his first formal medical consultation in 7 years. The familiar sounds and smells in a pediatric ward brought back memories, both wonderful and terrible successful surgeries that saved young lives, grateful families, and the devastating night when Tommy slipped away. Despite everyone's best efforts, Dr. Patricia Hernandez was a woman in her late 40s with graying hair and a patient demeanor that came from decades of working with sick children and worried parents. She greeted Jonathan warmly, having developed a relationship with the family over months of Emma's care, then turned her attention to David with professional curiosity. "Dr. Carter, I've reviewed Emma's file in preparation for our consultation," she said, gesturing toward a conference room. "Your credentials are impressive, though I notice there's a gap in your recent practice history." David had prepared for this moment, knowing that his credibility would determine whether Emma received the treatment she needed. "I took an extended leave from medicine due to personal issues, but my training and diagnostic experience remain current." Dr. Hernandez nodded noncommittally, clearly waiting for more detailed explanation. Jonathan intervened before David could elaborate on his circumstances. "Dr. Hernandez, with respect, Dr. Carter's current situation is less important than his medical insights regarding Emma's case. He's identified a potential diagnosis that explains all of her symptoms. Mitochondrial cytopathy with copper accumulation," Dr. Hernandez said, consulting her notes. "You mentioned this yesterday. It's an extremely rare condition, and I have to say, Emma's presentation doesn't fit the classic textbook description." David leaned forward, his medical training overriding his nervousness. "That's exactly why it's missed so often. The textbook presentations assume late-stage disease when symptoms are obvious. Early-stage copper accumulation presents as chronic fatigue, intermittent weakness, subtle neurological changes, and the specific pallor with jaundice undertones that I observed in Emma's photograph." "You made this diagnosis from a photograph?" Dr. Hernandez's tone carried scientific skepticism. "I made an educated hypothesis based on the photograph, which Mr. Meridian's description of Emma's symptoms supported. The definitive diagnosis requires specific testing that hasn't been performed yet." Dr. Hernandez pulled up Emma's test results on her computer screen. "We've done comprehensive blood work, genetic screening, metabolic panels, imaging studies. Everything has been normal or inconclusive. Because standard metabolic panels don't test for copper transport dysfunction," David explained patiently. "You need 24-hour urine copper levels, serum ceruloplasmin, and if those are abnormal, liver biopsy to confirm tissue copper accumulation. Those are specialized tests with specific indications," Dr. Hernandez replied. "The hospital requires justification for expensive diagnostic procedures, especially when recommended by, she paused delicately, by someone who isn't currently practicing medicine. David finished quietly. I understand your position, Dr. Hernandez, but Emma's life may depend on those tests being performed quickly. Jonathan could see the conversation deteriorating and decided to intervene more directly. What would it take to authorize these tests immediately? Dr. Hernandez looked uncomfortable. Mr. Meridian, I understand your desperation, but medical ethics require that I base diagnostic decisions on sound clinical reasoning, not external pressure. Then let me give you sound clinical reasoning, David said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone Jonathan had noticed before. Emma Meridian presents with a 6-month history of progressive fatigue, intermittent weakness, cognitive symptoms including word-finding difficulties and attention problems, and physical examination reveals subtle jaundice and specific neurological changes consistent with basal ganglia involvement. Dr. Hernandez listened with growing attention as David continued his clinical presentation. Standard workups have been negative because they don't address copper metabolism dysfunction. The combination of neurological and systemic symptoms, the progressive nature, and the specific age of onset all point to Wilson's disease variant or hepatolenicular degeneration with early presentation. If you're correct, Dr. Hernandez said slowly, then Emma is facing potential liver failure and permanent brain damage without treatment. Yes, David replied simply, which is why we need those tests today, not next week. Dr. Hernandez was quiet for several minutes, reviewing Emma's file and weighing David's clinical reasoning against her institutional obligations. Finally, she looked up at both men. I'll authorize the copper studies and expedite the results. But I want Dr. Carter present for all consultations regarding Emma's case. If he's right about this diagnosis, I need his expertise for treatment planning. Jonathan felt a surge of relief and gratitude. Thank you, Dr. Hernandez. When can we get the test done? This afternoon? We can have results by tomorrow morning if I mark them as urgent. She turned to David. Dr. Carter, assuming the tests confirm copper accumulation, what's your recommended treatment protocol? David's medical instincts engaged fully as he outlined treatment options. Chelation therapy with penicillamine or trinitine to remove excess copper, plus zinc supplementation to block further copper absorption. The specific regimen depends on the degree of accumulation and organ involvement. That's aggressive treatment with significant side effects, Dr. Hernandez noted. Less aggressive than watching Emma develop permanent neurological damage, David replied. The side effects are manageable and reversible. Brain damage isn't. As they finalized plans for Emma's testing, Jonathan watched David transform from homeless supplicant to confident medical professional. This was the man who had once been chief of pediatric surgery, the doctor who had saved countless children's lives before one tragic case destroyed everything. For the first time since Emma's illness began, Jonathan felt genuine hope that his daughter might be saved. But he also recognized that David's redemption was tied inextricably to Emma's recovery. If the treatment failed, it would destroy them both. Emma's testing took place that afternoon in a familiar pediatric lab, where she had endured dozens of procedures over the previous months. But this time felt different. There was an urgency that hadn't been present before, and the strange doctor who had visited their house was present throughout the process. David watched the technicians draw Emma's blood and collect urine samples with the intensity of someone whose entire future depended on the results. He found himself remembering Tommy during similar procedures, how the boy had trusted that the tests would help him feel better, never knowing that time was running out while doctors pursued the wrong diagnosis. Dr. Carter, will these tests hurt? Emma asked as the technician prepared for the blood draw. Just a little pinch, like a mosquito bite, David replied gently. using the same words he had offered countless frightened children during his years. In practice. But it's going to help us figure out how to make you feel much better. Emma nodded bravely and held out her thin arm, wincing only slightly as the needle found her vein. David noticed how easily the technician located her vessels, a sign that Emma was still well hydrated and her circulation was good. Both positive indicators for treatment response, if his diagnosis proved correct. Sarah held Emma's hand throughout the procedures, her own anxiety evident in the tight lines around her eyes. She had spent the previous night researching copper metabolism disorders, learning more than she had ever wanted to know about Wilson's disease, mitochondrial dysfunction, and the potential for irreversible neurological damage. "When will we know?" Sarah asked David quietly as they waited for the lab work to be completed. "Dr. Hernandez marked everything as urgent," David replied. "We should have results by tomorrow morning, possibly sooner if the lab can process them. Tonight, and then what?" David chose his words carefully, aware that Emma was listening despite her obvious fatigue. "Then we'll know exactly what's making Emma feel sick, and we can start the right treatment to help her get better." As they prepared to leave the hospital, Emma stumbled slightly, catching herself against David's arm. The brief contact sent alarm. Through him, her grip was weaker than it should have been, and he could feel the slight tremor that indicated neurological involvement was progressing. "Daddy, I feel dizzy," Emma said in a small voice. Jonathan immediately scooped his daughter into his arms, and David noticed how light she seemed, another concerning sign that Emma's condition was advancing more rapidly than he had hoped. "Let's get you home and rested," Jonathan said, trying to keep worry out of his voice. But as they walked toward the parking garage, Emma's head lolled against her father's shoulder with the kind of sudden exhaustion that David recognized as a neurological red flag. They were running out of time faster than he had anticipated. During the drive home, David found himself in the unfamiliar position of being a guest in a family's crisis, rather than the primary physician managing it. The dynamics were strange. He had the medical knowledge to help Emma, but none of the institutional authority to make decisions about her care. "David," Jonathan said as they pulled into his driveway, "I want you to stay here tonight. Emma's gotten worse today, and I'd feel better having you close by in case something happens." David hesitated, acutely aware of how his presence might complicate the family's routine. "I don't want to impose." "You're not imposing," Sarah interrupted from the back seat where she was monitoring Emma's condition. "You're the first person in 6 months who's given us real hope. Please stay." That evening, David found himself in the strange position of being a houseguest in a mansion while technically homeless. The Meridian family's wealth was evident everywhere: original artwork, expensive furniture, a kitchen that looked like it belonged in a magazine, but David noticed that none of it seemed to bring Jonathan or Sarah any comfort, while their daughter suffered. Emma managed to eat a small dinner before retreating to the living room couch, where she curled up with her blanket and tried to watch a children's movie. David observed her carefully, noting the way she squinted at the television screen and the frequency with which she rubbed her temples. "Headaches?" he asked quietly, settling into a nearby chair. Emma nodded. "They come and go. Sometimes the light makes them worse." Another neurological symptom that confirmed David's diagnostic suspicions and added urgency to getting treatment started. Copper accumulation in the brain tissue was causing inflammation that would only worsen until chelation therapy began removing the excess mineral. Around 9 o'clock, Emma's condition took a concerning turn. She became confused about where she was, asking Sarah if they were at Grandma's house and seeming surprised to see David sitting nearby. The episode lasted only a few minutes, but it left all 3 adults deeply shaken. "Should we take her to the emergency room?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with panic. David considered the question carefully. "The heir won't be able to do anything. We haven't already initiated. Her symptoms are concerning, but not immediately life-threatening. We need to wait for the test results to confirm the diagnosis before starting treatment. But if she gets worse, then we'll get her to the hospital. Immediately, David promised. I'll stay up tonight to monitor her condition. If there's any significant change, we'll take action. Jonathan made up the guest room for David, but found himself unable to sleep, checking on Emma every hour throughout the night. Each time he looked in on his daughter, he found David sitting quietly in the hallway outside her room, maintaining a vigil that spoke to both his medical training and his personal investment in Emma's recovery. Around 3 a.m., Jonathan found David sitting on the floor outside Emma's door, his back against the wall and his eyes fixed on the 6-month sobriety chip he was turning over and over in his hands. Couldn't sleep either? Jonathan asked quietly, settling down beside David. I keep thinking about timing, David replied. If Emma's condition is as advanced as tonight's symptoms suggest, we may have only days to start treatment before the neurological damage becomes irreversible. Jonathan felt his chest tighten. You said it was treatable if caught in time. It is, but in time is a moving target that depends on how quickly the copper accumulation is progressing. Emma's cognitive episode tonight suggests we're approaching the critical window. They sat in silence for several minutes, two fathers separated by circumstances, but united in their concern for a little girl whose life hung in the balance. David, Jonathan said finally, regardless of what happens with Emma's treatment, I want you to know that you've already given us something invaluable hope. For 6 months, we've watched our daughter get sicker while doctors ran test after test with no answers. You gave us a path forward. David continued to turn the sobriety chip in his hands. I need her to get better, Jonathan. Not just because she deserves to be healthy, but because I need to prove to myself that I can still save a life instead of losing one. My sobriety, my sanity, my entire sense of self-worth is tied up in Emma's recovery. That's a heavy burden to carry. It's the burden I've carried for 7 years, David replied. The difference is that now I have a chance to transform it from guilt into redemption. As dawn approached, both men remained in their vigil outside Emma's room, waiting for test results that would determine whether David's diagnosis was correct and whether they had caught Emma's condition in time to save her life and restore his purpose. Inside her room, Emma slept fitfully, unaware that her recovery had become the key to healing not just her own body, but the broken spirit of a man who had lost everything and was finally ready to fight for the chance to save them both. The call from Dr. Hernandez came at 7:30 the next morning, earlier than expected and with results that changed everything David thought he understood about Emma's case and his own past failures. Jonathan answered the phone in the kitchen while Sarah prepared Emma's breakfast upstairs. David sat at the table, his hands wrapped around a coffee mug, trying to read Jonathan's expression as the conversation progressed. Yes, Dr. Hernandez. We can be there within the hour, Jonathan said, his voice carefully controlled. Thank you. Thank you. For expediting the results. After hanging up, Jonathan turned to David with an expression that mixed vindication with new concerns. You were right. Emma's urine copper is severely elevated, and her ceruloplasmin levels are dangerously low. Dr. Hernandez wants to see us immediately to discuss treatment options. David felt a complex mixture of relief and dread. He'd been right about Emma's diagnosis, which meant she could be treated and saved. But it also meant confronting the reality that he had missed the same condition in Tommy, leading to the boy's preventable death. There's something else, Jonathan continued quietly. Dr. Hernandez said the test results were so abnormal that she consulted with a specialist in metabolic disorders. She wants to discuss Emma's case with the entire pediatric team. An hour later, they sat in a conference room at Children's Hospital, surrounded by more medical professionals than Emma had seen during her entire 6 months of illness. Dr. Hernandez had assembled a team that included a metabolic specialist, a neurologist, a hepatologist, and a pharmacist who specialized in chelation therapy. Dr. Robert Kim, the metabolic specialist, took the lead in discussing Emma's results. The test results confirmed severe copper accumulation consistent with Wilson's disease variant. Emma's urine copper levels are more than 5 times normal, and her ceruloplasmin is virtually undetectable. What does that mean for treatment? Sarah asked, having joined them after arranging care for Emma, who was too tired to accompany her parents to the hospital. It means Dr. Carter's diagnosis was correct, and we need to begin aggressive chelation therapy immediately, Dr. Kim replied. However, there are some unusual aspects to Emma's case that we need to discuss. David felt his stomach clench. What kind of unusual aspects? Dr. Kim consulted his notes. Most children with Wilson's disease present with liver symptoms first, followed by neurological involvement. Emma's presentation is primarily neurological from the beginning, which suggests a specific genetic variant that affects copper transport in the brain more directly. Is that significant for treatment? Jonathan asked. It means Emma may respond differently to standard protocols, Dr. Kim explained. We'll need to monitor her very closely and potentially modify our approach based on her response. Dr. Hernandez turned to David. Dr. Carter, given your experience with this condition, we'd like you to participate in Emma's treatment planning. Are you available to serve as a consulting physician? David felt the weight of redemption and terror in equal measure. I appreciate the confidence, but I should disclose that my medical license is currently inactive due to personal circumstances. Dr. Kim waved dismissively. Your diagnostic accuracy suggests your clinical skills remain sharp. We can bring you on as a special consultant under my supervision. Emma's case is complex enough to warrant bringing in all available expertise. As the medical team discussed treatment protocols and monitoring procedures, David found himself studying the paperwork Dr. Hernandez had prepared. Among the consultation forms and treatment authorizations was something unexpected, a medical license reinstatement application that had been partially completed in his name. Dr. Hernandez, David said quietly, what is this? She looked slightly embarrassed. Mr. Meridian contacted me yesterday evening about the process for restoring your medical credentials. Given your diagnostic accuracy with Emma's case and our need for expertise in copper metabolism disorders, I took the liberty of initiating the consultation paperwork. David turned to Jonathan in shock. You did this without telling me? I told you I'd do everything possible to help you rebuild your career if you could save Emma, Jonathan replied simply. Dr. Hernandez confirmed that your case could be expedited given the circumstances. Dr. Kim interjected. Dr. Carter, I should mention that I've been involved in several license reinstatement cases. Your situation losing your license due to personal problems rather than medical incompetence actually has a good prognosis for restoration, especially with a successful case like Emma's to demonstrate continued clinical competency. David felt overwhelmed by the sudden possibility that his medical career might be resurrected along with Emma's health. But the weight of his past failure pressed down on him like a physical burden. There's something you need to know, David sighed quietly. The patient I lost, Tommy, he had the same condition as Emma. I missed the diagnosis completely, and he died because of my failure. The room fell silent as David's confession hung in the air. Dr. Kim was the first to respond, his tone gentle but professional. Dr. Carter, can you tell us about Tommy's presentation and timeline? With great difficulty, David recounted Tommy's case, the initial appendicitis presentation, the post-surgical complications that didn't make sense, and the gradual realization that something else was causing the boy's deterioration. How long from initial symptoms to the end? Dr. Kim asked. 3 weeks from the time the neurological symptoms became obvious, David replied. But in hindsight, he probably had subtle signs for months before the appendicitis brought him to medical attention. Dr. Kim exchanged glances with Dr. Hernandez before speaking. Dr. Carter, based on your description, Tommy's case was significantly more advanced than Emma's. The rapid neurological decline suggests he had been accumulating copper for years without detection. That doesn't excuse my missing the diagnosis, David said. Perhaps not, Dr. Kim replied gently. But it explains why the case was so difficult to diagnose and why the outcome was poor. Emma's case, by contrast, appears to have been caught much earlier in the progression. Dr. Hernandez leaned forward. Dr. Carter, your experience with Tommy, tragic as it was, is probably why you recognized Emma's condition so quickly. Sometimes our greatest failures teach us lessons that enable our most important successes. David looked around the room at the assembled medical professionals who were treating him as a colleague rather than a failed doctor seeking redemption. You're willing to trust Emma's treatment to someone who made such a devastating mistake? We're willing to trust Emma's treatment to someone who learned from that mistake and used that knowledge to save her life, Dr. Kim replied. Your diagnostic accuracy suggests that Tommy's death, while tragic, gave you insights that may have saved Emma from the same fate. Jonathan reached across the table to clasp David's shoulder. David, you didn't come to my office by accident. You didn't notice Emma's symptoms by chance. Tommy's case prepared you to recognize what Emma's other doctors missed. His death wasn't meaningless if it leads to Emma's recovery. As the medical team finalized Emma's treatment plan, David felt something he hadn't experienced in 7 years. Possibility of redemption through service rather than suffering. Emma's illness had given him the chance to transform his greatest failure into his most important victory. And in doing so, reclaim not just his medical career, but his sense of purpose and self-worth. The irony was profound. The condition that had destroyed his life when he failed to diagnose it in Tommy had now provided the path back to everything he had lost when he recognized it in Emma. Sometimes the very thing that breaks us also holds the key to our healing. If we're brave enough to face it and wise enough to learn from it. Dr. Kim began outlining the chelation protocol that would save Emma's life. But David found himself thinking about Tommy and the way some failures, when faced with courage and grace, could transform into the foundation for redemption and new hope. Emma's treatment began 48 hours later in the pediatric intensive care unit, where she could be monitored closely for the potentially serious side effects of aggressive chelation therapy. David stood outside her room wearing scrubs and a visitor's badge, watching through the glass as nurses prepared the IV medications that would either save her life or confirm his fears that they had waited too long. The chelation protocol Dr. Kim had designed was more aggressive than standard. Treatment tailored specifically for Emma's unusual presentation and the advanced nature of her copper accumulation. The medications would pull copper from her tissues and organs, but the process would also stress her kidneys, potentially cause severe nausea, and might initially worsen her neurological symptoms before they improved. Are you ready for this? Dr. Hernandez asked as she joined David at Emma's window. David watched Emma sleeping fitfully in the hospital bed, looking impossibly small, surrounded by monitors and medical equipment. As ready as anyone can be when a child's life depends on your clinical judgment. The treatment plan is sound, Dr. Hernandez assured him. Dr. Kim has consulted with specialists at 3 major medical centers, and everyone agrees this is our best approach. But David's anxiety went deeper than medical uncertainty. Emma's case had reawakened memories of Tommy that he had spent years trying to suppress. The boy's trust in his doctors, his parents' desperate hope, and the crushing realization when treatment failed and hope transformed into grief. Sarah and Jonathan had spent the previous night at Emma's bedside, taking turns reading her favorite stories and holding her hand as she drifted in and out of sleep. Emma's condition had stabilized but not improved. The confusion episodes were becoming more frequent, and her physical weakness was more pronounced. Dr. Carter, Emma said softly as David entered her room that morning. "Are you going to make me all better?" The question was identical to one Tommy had asked, and David felt his chest tighten with the weight of promises he couldn't guarantee. "Emma, the medicines we're going to give you are very strong, and they're going to help your body get rid of the things that are making you sick. But you're going to need to be very brave, because you might feel worse for a few days before you start feeling better." Emma considered this seriously, displaying the remarkable wisdom that sick children often developed. "Will you stay with me while I'm getting better?" "I'll be right here," David promised, meaning it completely. He had failed to save Tommy, but he would not leave Emma's side until she was healthy, or until there was nothing more he could do. Dr. Kim arrived with the pharmacy team to begin Emma's first chelation treatment. The process was complex, multiple 4 medications that had to be administered in precise sequences, careful monitoring of her kidney function, and frequent blood draws to track the copper levels being pulled from her tissues. The first 48 hours will tell us how well Emma responds to treatment, Dr. Kim explained to the assembled family. "We expect to see copper levels rise in her blood initially as the medication pulls it from her organs. That's actually a good sign, even though it might make her symptoms temporarily worse." David positioned himself at Emma's bedside as the first medications began flowing through her fore. He found himself remembering the countless times he had started similar treatments as a practicing physician, but the perspective was different. Now, he was intimately connected to the outcome in a way that went beyond professional obligation. Within hours of beginning treatment, Emma developed the nausea and fatigue that Dr. Kim had predicted. She could barely keep water down, and her neurological symptoms seemed to intensify. More confusion, increased hand tremors, and periods of disorientation that left her frightened and crying for her parents. "This is normal," David repeated to Jonathan and Sarah as they watched their daughter struggle through the early stages of treatment. "The copper that's been poisoning her system for months is being mobilized, and it has to pass through her bloodstream before her kidneys can eliminate it. She's going to feel worse before she feels better." But even as David offered reassurance, he battled his own demons. Every time Emma cried out in confusion or retched from the medication's side effects, he remembered Tommy's similar suffering and the way hope had slowly transformed into despair as treatment failed to help. On the second day of chelation, Emma's condition reached its lowest point. She was barely conscious, her small body racked with tremors, and her copper levels had spiked to dangerous heights as the medication pulled the toxic mineral from her organs. The medical team gathered for an emergency consultation as Emma's kidney function showed signs of stress from processing the massive copper load. "We may need to slow the chelation rate," Dr. Kim said, studying Emma's latest lab results. "Her kidneys are struggling to handle the copper elimination. If we slow the treatment, does that reduce her chances of full recovery?" Jonathan asked, his face pale with exhaustion and worry. Dr. Kim glanced at David before answering. "Dr. Carter, what's your clinical opinion?" David studied Emma's chart, weighing the risks of aggressive treatment against the certainty of progressive neurological damage if they didn't remove the copper quickly enough. It was the kind of life or death decision that had terrified him since Tommy's case. But Emma's life depended on his willingness to trust his medical judgment despite his past failure. "We continue the current protocol," David said firmly. "Emma's kidney function is stressed but not failing. The copper levels will peak in the next 12 to 24 hours, then begin dropping as her body eliminates the excess mineral. If we reduce the chelation rate now, we risk leaving enough copper in her brain tissue to cause permanent damage." Dr. Kim nodded agreement. "That's my assessment as well. We continue current treatment but increase monitoring to every 2 hours. That night, David maintained a vigil beside Emma's bed that reminded him of his medical residency when he would spend entire nights monitoring critically ill patients. But this felt different, more personal, more desperate, waited with the knowledge that Emma's recovery represented not just her return to health, but his own redemption. Around 3 a.m., Emma's condition reached a crisis point. Her temperature spiked, her neurological symptoms worsened dramatically, and her blood pressure became unstable. The monitors surrounding her bed began alarming, bringing Dr. Kim and the nursing staff running. "What's happening?" Sarah cried as medical personnel surrounded Emma's bed. David checked Emma's pupils with a penlight, noting their response and the slight improvement in their reactivity. "Her body is fighting to eliminate the copper load. This is the critical phase. If she can get through the next few hours, she should start improving rapidly." But even as he spoke the words, David wondered if he was offering false hope based on wishful thinking rather than medical evidence. Emma looked so fragile, so overwhelmed by the aggressive treatment that it seemed impossible she could survive the cure for her illness. "David," Jonathan said quietly, pulling him aside, "tell me honestly, is she going to make it?" David looked at his friend, because that's what Jonathan had become during this crisis. A true friend who had seen past his homelessness and addiction to the physician within, and struggled with how much truth he could bear to share. "The next 6 hours will determine Emma's outcome," David said quietly. "If her body can process the copper load without organ failure, she not only survive but make a complete recovery. If the treatment is too much for her system to handle, she could die from the cure rather than the disease." Jonathan finished. David nodded, unable to voice the possibility that had haunted him since treatment began. Emma might survive months or years with copper accumulation, living a diminished life with progressive neurological symptoms. But the aggressive treatment necessary to save her could kill her within hours if her body couldn't handle the stress. As dawn approached, David found himself praying for the first time since Tommy's death, not to a specific God, but to whatever force in the universe might care about the fate of sick children and the redemption of failed healers. Emma's recovery had become inseparable from his own healing, and he wasn't sure either of them would survive if the treatment failed. Dr. Kim arrived at 6 a.m. to review Emma's overnight progress, and David could see cautious optimism in the specialist's expression as he studied her latest lab results. "Her copper levels peaked 4 hours ago and is starting to decline," Dr. Kim reported. "Her kidney function has stabilized and her neurological responses are showing subtle improvement." "Does that mean she's going to be okay?" Sarah asked, afraid to hope after so many hours of watching her daughter suffer. "It means we're past the crisis point," Dr. Kim replied carefully. "If Emma continues improving over the next 12 hours, we can expect a full recovery." David felt tears he had been holding back for days finally spill over. Emma was going to survive. The aggressive treatment was working. The copper that had been slowly killing her was being eliminated from her system, and the neurological damage that had seemed inevitable was beginning to reverse. For the first time since Tommy's death, David had saved a child's life instead of losing one. The redemption he had sought through years of addiction and homelessness had finally come through the thing he feared most, trusting his medical judgment. With the child's life hanging in the balance, Emma stirred in her bed, her eyes opening with more clarity than David had seen in days. When she looked at him, she managed a weak smile that contained all the trust and gratitude he had once taken for granted as a practicing physician. "Dr. Carter," she whispered, "I think I'm getting better." "Yes, sweetheart," David replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You're getting much better." Emma's recovery began 12 hours later with small miracles that grew larger each day. Her first clear conversation without confusion came on the 3rd day of treatment, when she asked her mother for apple juice and remembered the names of all her stuffed animals. Her hand tremors stopped that afternoon, and by evening, she was sitting up in bed without assistance. David documented every improvement with the Meticulous attention of someone who understood how precious each positive change represented. Emma's copper levels were dropping steadily. Her neurological function was returning to normal, and her energy was increasing daily. The aggressive chelation therapy that had nearly killed her was now saving her life exactly as David had hoped. Dr. Kim conducted daily assessments that confirmed Emma's remarkable progress. Her copper levels have decreased by 60% from peak values, he reported during the morning medical team meeting. Her liver function is normalizing. Her neurological responses are completely intact, and she's showing no residual effects from the copper accumulation. How long until she can go home? Jonathan asked, barely containing his relief and joy. If she continues improving at this rate, she could be discharged within the week, Dr. Kim replied. She needed ongoing chelation therapy on an outpatient basis for several months, but the acute phase of treatment is nearly complete. David stood at the back of the conference room, still processing the reality that Emma was not only surviving but thriving. The little girl who had been dying from copper poisoning was now coloring pictures for her nurses, asking when she could go back to school, and displaying the irrepressible spirit of a healthy 8-year-old. But Emma's recovery represented more than medical success. It was validation that David's diagnostic skills remained sharp despite years away from practice, and proof that his greatest failure had taught him lessons that enabled his most important victory. Dr. Hernandez approached David after the medical team dispersed. Dr. Carter, I have news about your license reinstatement application. The medical board has agreed to an expedited review based on Emma's case and Dr. Kim's recommendations. David felt his heart race with possibilities he had never dared imagine. What does that mean? It means you can have your medical license restored within 3 months instead of the usual 2-year process. The board recognizes that your diagnostic accuracy with Emma demonstrates continued clinical competency, and your successful consultation during her treatment shows you can work effectively within a medical team. The prospect of returning to the medicine of being a doctor again rather than a homeless man with medical training seemed almost too wonderful to believe. David had spent so many years defining himself by his failure that the possibility of professional redemption felt surreal. There's one more thing, Dr. Hernandez continued. Children's Hospital has approved your appointment as a special consultant in our metabolic disorders clinic. If you're interested, you could begin working here as soon as your license is restored. David stared at her in amazement. Not only was Emma recovering completely, but his own life was being restored along with hers. The hospital that had witnessed his greatest triumph was offering him a chance to rebuild his career and serve other children who might benefit from his hard-won expertise. That afternoon, David sat beside Emma's bed as she worked on a new drawing. This one showing a doctor helping a little girl feel better. The artistic sophistication was limited by her 8-year-old skills, but the emotional content was unmistakable. Is this you and me? David asked, studying the drawing. Emma nodded proudly. You're the doctor who saved me. Daddy told me you lost your job helping sick children, but now you're going to get it back because you helped me. David felt tears threaten again as he considered the innocent wisdom in Emma's words. She understood, with the clarity that children sometimes possess, that healing could flow in both directions, that saving her life had also restored something essential in his own. Emma, do you know why I was so determined to help you get better? She looked at him seriously, her young face thoughtful. Because that's what doctors do. They help children who are sick. That's right, David replied. But also because I once knew another little boy who was sick like you were. I wasn't smart enough to figure out what was wrong with him, and he died because I failed to help him. Emma considered this information with the gravity that sick children learn early. That must have made you very sad. It did. So sad that I stopped being a doctor and forgot how to help anyone, including myself. But then you met me, Emma said simply. But then I met you, David agreed. And helping you remember how to be well helped me remember who I used to be. Emma handed him the completed drawing, which he accepted as carefully as if it were a medical diploma. In many ways, it represented the same thing: official recognition that he was once again a healer rather than someone broken by his failures. Jonathan and Sarah entered the room as visiting hours ended, their faces showing the transformation that comes with watching a beloved child return from the edge of serious illness to vibrant health. David, Jonathan said, I don't know how we can ever properly thank you. You gave us back our daughter's life. And she gave me back mine, David replied quietly. Emma's recovery proved that I could still be the doctor I once was, despite everything that happened with Tommy. Sarah embraced David with the fierce gratitude of a mother whose child had been saved. You'll always be part of our family now. Emma's recovery connected all of us in a way that goes beyond medicine. As David prepared to leave the hospital that evening, heading not to a homeless shelter, but to a small apartment that Jonathan had helped him secure, he reflected on the mysterious ways that healing could emerge from the deepest failures. Tommy's death had destroyed his confidence, his career, and his sense of purpose. But it had also taught him to recognize the symptoms that Emma's other doctors had missed, enabling him to save her life and reclaim his own in the process. Walking through the hospital corridors, where he would soon work again as a physician, David understood that redemption rarely comes through avoiding our failures, but through learning to transform them into wisdom that serves others. Emma's complete recovery was proof that sometimes our greatest defeats can become the foundation for our most important victories. 3 days later, Emma was discharged from Children's Hospital with a clean bill of health and a treatment plan that would ensure the copper accumulation never returned. David walked beside her wheelchair as Jonathan pushed her toward the hospital exit, carrying balloons and cards from the nursing staff who had watched her miraculous recovery. The transformation in Emma was remarkable. Her color had returned to normal. Her energy was that of a typical 8-year-old, and her cognitive function showed no residual effects from the months of copper poisoning. She chattered excitedly about going home, returning to school, and visiting her horse Thunder at the stables. Dr. Carter, will I see you again? Emma asked as they reached Jonathan's car. Every month for checkups, David promised. We need to make sure you stay healthy and strong. But David knew their relationship would extend far beyond medical appointments. Emma's case had forged bonds between them that transcended the typical doctor-patient dynamic. She represented his redemption, while he represented her second chance at a full life. As they drove home from the hospital, David found himself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought him from homeless desperation to professional resurrection. 6 months ago, he had been sleeping in shelters and struggling with sobriety. Today, he was a consulting physician with his medical license under review and an apartment of his own. The medical board hearing was scheduled for the following week, but Dr. Kim had assured David that Emma's case provided compelling evidence for license reinstatement. His diagnostic accuracy, successful treatment planning, and professional collaboration during her care demonstrated that his clinical skills remained intact despite his personal struggles. David, Jonathan said as they pulled into his driveway, Sarah and I have been talking, and we want to make you an offer. David looked at his friend curiously, wondering what other unexpected generosity the Meridian family might have in mind. We'd like to fund a free clinic specifically for homeless individuals who need medical care, Jonathan continued. You could serve as medical director once your license is restored, providing health care to people in circumstances similar to what you experienced. The proposal was so unexpected and perfect that David initially couldn't find words to respond. A clinic serving the homeless would combine his medical expertise with his intimate understanding of the challenges faced by people living on the streets. The city has been looking for solutions to the homeless healthcare crisis, Jonathan explained. Your unique background, medical training, combined with personal experience of homelessness, makes you ideally suited to lead such an effort." Emma climbed out of the car and took David's hand, her grip strong and confident. "Would you help other people like you helped me?" "Yes," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "I would help other people just like I helped you." That evening, the Meridian family hosted a small celebration dinner for Emma's recovery and David's. Return to medicine. The guest list was intimate: Dr. Hernandez, Dr. Kim, Father Miguel from the church where David had gotten sober, and a few close friends who had supported the family through Emma's illness. As they gathered around the dinner table, David found himself overwhelmed by the contrast with his life just weeks earlier. He had gone from eating alone in soup kitchens to sharing meals with people who valued his friendship and respected his professional abilities. "I'd like to propose a toast," Jonathan said, raising his wine glass. "To second chances, to the healing power of hope, and to the man who saved our daughter's life." "To Dr. Carter," Emma added solemnly, raising her glass of apple juice. David felt tears streaming down his face as he realized that Tommy's death, while tragic and devastating, had ultimately led him to this moment. His failure had taught him lessons that enabled him to save Emma, and her recovery had restored everything he had lost in the process. Dr. Hernandez leaned toward David. "I have news from the medical board. Your hearing has been moved up to tomorrow morning. They want to expedite your case based on Emma's successful outcome. The possibility that he might have his medical license restored within days rather than months felt almost too good to be true." David had spent so many years accepting that his medical career was over that the prospect of practicing again seemed surreal. "Are you ready?" Dr. Kim asked. David looked around the table at the faces of people who had become his friends, his colleagues, his chosen family. Emma was coloring again, her small hands steady and sure, completely recovered from the condition that had nearly killed her. Jonathan and Sarah were relaxed and happy in a way they hadn't been for months, their daughter's health restored and their faith in the future renewed. "I'm ready," David said, meaning it completely. That night, David sat in his small apartment, the first place he had called home in 7 years, and wrote a letter to Tommy's parents. He had avoided contact with them since the boy's death, unable to face their grief and his role in their loss. But Emma's recovery had taught him that healing sometimes required confronting the pain we had caused as well as the pain we had suffered. The letter was difficult to write, filled with apologies that could never restore their son, but acknowledging the devastating impact of David's failure to diagnose Tommy's condition. He also told them about Emma, about how Tommy's death had taught him to recognize the symptoms he had missed, and how that tragic lesson had enabled him to save another child's life. He didn't expect forgiveness or even response, but the letter represented his acceptance that Tommy's death was part of his story, not something to be forgotten or denied, but a tragic chapter that had ultimately led to Emma's survival and his own redemption. As David prepared for the medical board hearing that would determine his professional future, he understood that his journey from homeless addiction to restored purpose had been shaped by both his greatest failure and his most important success. Tommy and Emma were forever linked in his story, representing the devastating cost of missed opportunities and the healing power of second chances. Tomorrow, he would face the medical board and request the restoration of his license to practice medicine. But regardless of their decision, David knew that his true healing had already occurred, not through avoiding the consequences of his failures, but through learning to transform them into wisdom that could serve others who needed hope, healing, and the chance to begin again. 6 months later, Dr. David Carter stood in the main treatment room of the Meridian Free Clinic, watching his colleague examine a homeless veteran who had been living under the downtown bridge for 3 years. The clinic had opened just 2 months earlier, but they were already seeing over 100 patients each week, people who had been invisible to the traditional healthcare system until David's unique perspective brought them into focus. The morning sun streamed through the clinic's windows, illuminating the waiting area where Emma Meridian sat reading to a group of younger children whose parents were receiving medical care. Her recovery had been complete and remarkable. No residual effects from the copper accumulation. Her energy fully restored, and her natural compassion deepened by her experience with serious illness. Dr. Carter called Maria Santos, the clinic's nurse practitioner. Mrs. Patterson in room 2 is showing signs of the same metabolic condition you identified in the Meridian case. David nodded, feeling the familiar surge of purpose that came with potentially life-saving diagnosis. Over the past months, his expertise in recognizing rare conditions had identified 3 more cases of copper metabolism disorders, 2 thyroid dysfunctions that had been missed by emergency room physicians, and numerous treatable conditions that might have gone undiagnosed among the homeless population. The medical board had restored David's license without restriction after reviewing Emma's case and the testimony of Dr. Kim and Dr. Hernandez. The hearing had been emotional, with David acknowledging his past failures while demonstrating how those experiences had prepared him to serve patients that other physicians might overlook. Jonathan appeared in the clinic doorway, carrying coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose philanthropic investment was producing measurable results. The Meridian Foundation had funded not just the clinic's establishment, but also a medical school scholarship program for students committed to serving underserved populations. "How are we doing today?" Jonathan asked, surveying the busy clinic with obvious pride. 37 patients so far, including 2 who needed immediate hospitalization for conditions that could have been fatal if left untreated, David reported. "The early intervention model is working exactly as we hoped." Emma looked up from her reading group and waved at both men. At 9 years old, she had become the clinic's unofficial mascot and volunteer coordinator, organizing toy drives for young patients and reading programs for families in the waiting room. Her experience with serious illness had given her unusual empathy for people facing medical challenges. "Daddy, Dr. Carter, come see what we made," Emma called out, holding up artwork created by the children in her reading group. The drawing showed doctors helping patients, families celebrating recovery, and children playing together regardless of their circumstances. The innocent optimism in the artwork reflected the hope that the clinic represented healing that addressed not just medical conditions but the social isolation and despair that often accompanied poverty and homelessness. David knelt beside Emma's chair, studying the children's artwork with the same attention he gave to medical charts. "These are beautiful. What story were you reading?" "The one about the horse named Thunder who helps lost people find their way home," Emma replied. "Like you helped me find my way back to being healthy." The simple wisdom in Emma's words reminded David of how much both of their lives had been transformed by their unlikely meeting. She had given him the chance to prove that his medical skills could still save lives, while he had restored her health and future possibilities. Dr. Kim arrived for his weekly consultation rounds, bringing with him a medical student who was interested in specializing in metabolic disorders. The partnership between the free clinic and children's hospital had created opportunities for medical education that benefited both institutions. "Dr. Carter," Dr. Kim said, "I have news about the research paper we've been writing on copper metabolism disorders in pediatric populations. The Journal of Pediatric Medicine has accepted it for publication." David felt a surge of professional satisfaction that he had never expected to experience again. The paper would share lessons learned from Tommy's case and Emma's successful treatment, potentially helping other physicians recognize and treat the rare condition more effectively. "There's something else," Dr. Kim continued. "The American Academy of Pediatrics has invited you to present our findings at their national conference. Your journey from personal failure to diagnostic expertise represents an important story for the medical community." The invitation to address his professional peers felt like the final step in David's Rehabilitation, not just the restoration of his license, but recognition that his experience had value for other physicians who might face similar challenges. As the afternoon progressed, David found himself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought him from the depths of addiction and homelessness to professional respect and personal fulfillment. Emma's case had been the catalyst, but the real transformation had come from learning to serve others despite his own brokenness. Sarah Meridian arrived to collect Emma from her volunteer duties, bringing with her the quiet contentment of a mother whose child had been restored to perfect health. The family's gratitude had never diminished, but it had evolved into something deeper, a lasting friendship based on shared experience and mutual respect. "David," Sarah said, "we wanted you to know that we received a letter yesterday from Tommy's parents." David's heart clenched, wondering what Tommy's family might have written in response to his letter of apology and explanation. "They thanked you," Sarah continued gently. "They said knowing that Tommy's death had taught you to save Emma made their loss feel less meaningless. They're proud that their son's story helped another child live." David felt tears he had thought were exhausted after months of healing. Tommy's parents' forgiveness didn't erase the tragedy of their loss, but it transformed his guilt into something more bearable, a reminder that even our worst failures can ultimately serve purposes we never imagined. As evening approached and the clinic prepared to close, David walked through the treatment rooms where dozens of people had received care that day. Many were individuals he had met during his own years of homelessness, people who remembered him as Doc and trusted him to understand their circumstances because he had shared them. Emma helped David lock up the clinic, a responsibility she took seriously despite her young age. As they walked toward Jonathan's car, she slipped her small hand into his with the natural affection of someone who understood that he had saved her life and she had saved his. "Dr. Carter," Emma said as they reached the parking lot, "do you know what I want to be when I grow up? A veterinarian?" David guessed, remembering her early fascination with animals. "A doctor," Emma replied solemnly. "Like you. Someone who helps children who are sick and helps doctors who are sad." David knelt beside Emma, understanding that her recovery had given her more than restored health. It had provided her with purpose and direction that might shape her entire life. Just as Tommy's death had ultimately led to Emma's salvation, Emma's illness had revealed her calling to heal others. "That would make me very proud," David said quietly. "The world needs doctors who understand that healing works both ways, that helping others can also heal the healer." As Jonathan's car pulled away from the clinic, David looked back at the building that represented his second chance. Tomorrow would bring new patients, new challenges, and new opportunities to transform his hard-won wisdom into service for others who needed hope. The homeless man who had stumbled into a corporate office, seeking employment, had found something better than a job. He had reclaimed his purpose, restored his profession, and discovered that redemption often comes not through forgetting our failures, but through learning to use them in service of others who need healing. Emma waved from the car window as they drove away, her smile bright with the health and happiness that David had helped restore. In saving her life, he had saved his own, and in the process, both of them had learned that sometimes our greatest victories emerge from the ashes of our most devastating defeats. The Meridian Free Clinic would serve thousands of patients in the years to come, but it would always be founded on the simple truth that David and Emma had discovered together, that healing is possible even after hope seems lost, and that second chances, when embraced with courage and service to others, can transform both the healer and the healed.